Hello, everybody. This is our second video lecture of our series of quarantine video lectures. Today's topic is going to be on the social construction of race and ethnicity. Let me say a couple of things about this video lecture before kind of jumping right in. The first thing I would say is this video lecture actually is probably going to be a little bit shorter than a typical lecture and a typical video lecture, because I had planned for a series of kind of activities that we were going to do that you can kind of see or guess at in the PowerPoint slides. But unfortunately, we can't do them, because it's now a video lecture rather than in person. So there's that. The second more important thing I would want to say before jumping in is, obviously the topic of race and ethnicity is a sensitive topic. And, particularly right now, I think it has become, a sensitive topic, or, an important topic, but one charged with emotions. And this, America, this is actually not something new to American history. America has gone through many moments in which the issue of race has become, a flashpoint. From slavery, from the Civil War to the Civil Rights Movement, and in our current era. And so, I understand that, today's topic, and when we will be talking about race in the future, are sensitive topics that are filled with emotion and people have strong opinions about. Now, one thing I would say is, what sociology allows us to do is to try to talk about race in a new way. It allows us to kind of try to understand the topic of race through the lens of social science. It gives us some kind of background to say, okay, well, how is this dynamic of race and race relations? How is that a phenomenon that affects all humans? It's not just an American phenomenon. It is a worldwide, human social phenomenon. And so, what I would say is, this gives us kind of a way to talk about and think about race in maybe a new way. Second thing I would say is, you don't have to accept everything I tell you today. You are college students now, and that means you are able to form your own opinion, right? You're able to form your own ideas. What I would say, though, is, you should not reject what I say out of hand either. If you form an opinion, if you have an idea about race or ethnicity or anything else, it should be an informed opinion, right? The goal of college is to produce citizens, to produce people who are informed about their society, informed about their world. So whereas you don't have to accept everything I tell you, I would ask you to think about it and to come to your own opinion in an informed way. Okay, so let me now jump in. I'm going to share the screen, and so hopefully you should be able to see the PowerPoint slides as I put them up. I'm going to be trying to show a short video as well today. Okay, so today's topic is about the social construction of race and ethnicity. So it's really about how people experience this identity of race and this identity of ethnicity. In future classes, we'll be talking about the issues of inequality around race and ethnicity. Today's class is really about the experience of it and what these categories of race and ethnicity really mean. So to see, kind of talk about some brief activities that I was going to do, but I'll kind of go through them quickly, and so you can kind of get a sense of what it was going to be about, and then lead into two topics for today. How do we define race, and what does it mean to say that race is a social construction? And then talk about the definition of ethnicity. How is ethnicity different from race? And then talk about the topic of symbolic ethnicity and how symbolic ethnicity interacts with race. Right? Okay, so let's jump in. So one of the first things I was going to ask you to do is, talk about, list out the racial categories that they think exist in the world, right? We all have these ideas. The idea of race is something that we all have, right? And the question is, how do we divide up the world? How do we divide up the world into the different races? So that's really kind of just got us thinking. A typical way in America is to talk about, predominantly skin color. So we talk about white or Caucasian, we talk about African American or Black, and then we have some other categories such as Hispanic, Asian, Native American or Native Indian, right? Native Indian American, right? So again, we beginning to see that the labels get confusing. And then more recently, we see that new categories or new labels have been added. Middle Eastern is a relatively new category, and actually even the label of Hispanic as a racial category is something relatively new, not older than say 20 or 30 years actually as a racial category. So then, okay, we do this activity, we talk about it in class, and then we talk about, I show you some pictures of people of different races. And the question is to get people thinking about, who are these people? How would we classify them as race? And so I start off with some easy ones. So, this guy here, I think would be pretty typically classified as white or Caucasian, right? In terms of how he looks, his physical features. Then we would, have, somebody, this woman here, who I think would be identified as Asian, right? Because it has physical features that suggest that she has an Asian identity, right? Racial identity, right? Then we have somebody who would be identified as African American, right? This, if anybody can guess, actually know who this person is. He's somebody with fair amount of recognition. This is the music producer Quincy Jones, right? But racial it would be identified racially categorized as African American or Black, right? Then it gets a little bit more confusing, right? So we see this actor here. If you don't know your TV shows, this is the actress from the Gilmore Girls. And so I showed this picture because often when people see this picture, see this actress, they identify her as being prototypically white. She has features, categories that identify her as being racially classified as white. But she is actually identified and self-identifies as Latina, right? Her father is from Argentina and her mother is from Mexico, right? And her first language is Spanish. So she is self-identifies, and would be identified by other people as being Hispanic. Right? Then another kind of, I pick people, TV and movie stars. So if you don't know this person, this is Wentworth Miller. He was in the show Prison Break, and then more recently, The Legends of Tomorrow. Right, so kind of a pretty typical TV star. And so when again, I think now it gets a little bit more ambiguous. Maybe we might have some questions like, oh, well, what race is this person? He has some features that would suggest he's white, but it's not clear. So he is actually half Black and half Middle Eastern. Right. Then we have another well-known star, right? This is Rashida Jones, famous TV star from shows like Parks and Rec and The Office. Right? Again, unclear racial background, but many people would perceive her to be as white, but she's actually half white and half Black. Rashida Jones is the daughter of Quincy Jones. Right? The Rock. Rock is an interesting persona, interesting person in general, but he is also a person with an interesting racial background. Right? And so, in America, I think many people would perceive The Rock to be African American, to be Black, right? Because that's what we perceive. It's often the category that we perceive in America. So, what is his actual racial background? He's Pacific Islander. He's Canadian from Nova Scotia. And he's white and Asian. actually. So he has he's from Samoa, his background, and or some of his background, racial background. So he's actually an interesting person, in terms of his racial categories and how that then gets perceived within the American context, right? If he had become a star, if he had grown up in a different country, I think his racial background would be perceived in a different way, actually. This actually, I put this person in because he is a famous sociologist, somewhat famous sociologist. This is Malcolm Gladwell. You may have seen his books or his podcasts, or he has a sociology degree and he writes in the public in sociology. Again, he seems or appears to be have many features that are prototypically white, Caucasian, but he's actually half white and half African American, right? But again, in American context, he might just be perceived as Caucasian. Mariah Carey, right? Famous music star. Again, how do we perceive her racial background? So her actual racial background is African Venezuelan, right? So Hispanic and Irish. This is some of her ethnic background. So she again has an interesting racial. She's an interesting person in terms of categorization in terms of race. Last but not least, we have President Obama, and he's kind of again a well-known case of somebody who has an interesting racial background. So in America, he is perceived to be Black, to be African American. He is identified often as the first African American president, right? But again, he has an interesting background. His father is African American, but his mother is white, right? From English descent of German and Irish, and his father is has a descent from Kenya. So again, he is identified, in an American context as being Black, even though his kind of his racial categorization is actually much more complicated. Okay, so all these photos and all these activities are really to point out that race is a much more complicated categorization than what we might first assume, right? At the start, we think we can just see a picture and say, oh, that person's white, or that person's Asian, or that person is Black. But what we can see is, in reality, race is a much more complicated thing and much more complex, right? It's not as easy as putting somebody into a box. So what is race? What can we say it is? How would we define it? So let me kind of talk about the kind of three important features of race. So the first is race is a way that we categorize people. We put people into a certain group based on their physical appearance, based on their physical features, right? So a person is thought to be in a racial group because of what they look like, right? In America, this is often based on skin color, right? And we see this in the very names of our racial categories: white, Black, right? And so, skin color is a big one, but it's also other physical traits, hair color, eye color, just general facial features. And so we think the idea is that people of a certain race all have the same physical features, right? Or, have physical features that are similar enough that we feel like we can group them together into that group, right? So first, physical features, right? And again, here, we think that these two people are of different races because we feel like they have clear differences in their physical appearances, right? In terms of skin color, hair, other physical features, facial features. Okay, second, race is this idea that we can put all the 6-7 billion people in the world into maybe 4 to 8 racial categories, maybe up to 10, but into some really big groupings, right? That we can kind of slot people into these really broad categories, white, African American, Hispanic, Asian, Middle Eastern, right? And we feel like we can do this and put all the people, there's a lot of people in the world, And we can put them into these kind of, maybe up to 10 categories. And so in that way, race is a very simplifying act. It says, okay, all these billions of people, we can put them into like 10 categories, 8 categories. And so it is really an act of simplification, right? Is what race is. It's saying, all these people, billions of people, they're all going to be the same. They're all going to be Asian. They're all going to be Hispanic. They're all going to be Middle Eastern, right? And so it's really an act of simplification, saying that there's no differences between these people. They're now all just the same because they belong to this racial group. Right? And here's a very typical way that we might divide up the world, in racial categorization in America. Right? And we can, in more recent times, we can add some categories: Hispanic, Middle Eastern. But again, these are actually quite recent in terms of race. They're not recent in terms of ethnicity, but they're recent in terms of racial categories. Like we think of these as only 20 or 30 years old. Particularly the category of Middle Eastern, actually. For a long time, Middle Eastern was simply included in the category of Caucasian, right? But now it has its own separate racial category, right? Third is again an important feature. The idea that the differences in the physical differences in racial groups is a symbol of something more. Right? That racial groups don't just have different bodies, right, or physical features, but they have different behaviors, different qualities, right? That they have different culture. That it's not just that we're perceiving differences in people's bodies, we're perceiving different types of people, right? That we are thinking of people as in some way being different from one another, not just in their physical appearance, but in how they are in the world. Right? And this is a very old, idea, right? From the 1800s onwards, 1700s onwards, the idea that different racial groups had different qualities, right? Was one that was widely accepted and to a certain degree still accepted today. So this is the idea of race. What then does it mean to say that race is a social construction? So let's review the idea of social construction. Social construction is the argument that humans take something to be natural, essential, to be real, but what they don't realize is that that thing that they take to be real is actually artificial, is an artificial construction of humans themselves. This is essentially what we mean when we say that race is a social construction. Many people still believe that race is something that is real, right? That race is a biological reality, that the racial groups, in America and around the world are really physically different from one another. The argument is that this is false, that there is no actual categorization, biological or essential categorization in terms of race, but rather race, categorizing people and putting them into different racial categories, is a artificial creation of humans. We see or perceive race, but it's not an actual reality that actually exists in nature. Now, this is sometimes a hard thing for people to accept because we tend to see race with our eyes. We tend to be able to look at somebody, such as the people in these pictures, and say, oh, these people look different from one another. Obviously, they must actually be different, right? That the person on the left is white and the person on the right is African American, right? That we think that we can see race with our eyes, and because of that, we think that race is real. It's seeing. If seeing is believing, then we believe in the reality of race. So what I'm arguing then really is that your eyes are lying to you, right? That you may think that you're seeing race as a reality, but you're seeing a social construction. You're seeing a reality that was created by humans. So what's some of the arguments for this? How can I make this argument? It's not just me, obviously, but how is this argument made? So let's start with the first one. The argument that race is social construction begins with the argument that there's too much physical variation between humans. So I'm not saying that race exists. I'm not saying that race is a social construction. I'm not saying that race doesn't actually exist because we're all the same, right? That we all look the same and we're all just humans or something like that. No, I'm actually saying the opposite. I'm saying that race is a social construction, race is artificial because there's too much differences between people. Right? Remember, one of the essential parts of the idea of race is that you can put people into like maybe 8 to 10 categories. And what I'm arguing is that actually that there's too much physical variation between all humans to simplify the world that much. Right? So it's not that there are no physical differences between people, but rather there's too many physical differences. So let's begin with skin color. Again, in America, this is a prime way that we categorize people into a racial category, right? And so we say that the person on the left is white and the person on the right is black because of how we perceive their skin. Now, skin color and the darkness of skin is made up by the amount of melanin in your skin. And so what we can understand is all people have different amounts of melanin, right? So you can see from this expanded photo here, right? All these people have different degrees of the darkness of their skin, going from lighter to darker, right? And again, we can go through these pictures more and more, and so, how could we just by skin color put somebody into, either white or black, right? That kind of is a very simplifying categorization, right? Again, what we see is we don't see a clear category. What we see is just a spectrum of skin color, right? From people from darker to lighter. And so the argument here is, right, in this picture here, which is from National Geographic, right? Who's deciding the line? Right? Who's deciding the line of what category makes somebody, white and what category makes somebody not white, right? Should we draw the line there, right? With the 3 people on the left and say, oh, everybody else is non-white? Or do we draw it there, right? Say, oh, well, no, now we're going to say all these people are white and the people on the right are now non-white, right? Or somewhere in the middle. The argument is we're the ones drawing that line. That's not nature. That's not biology. That's not anything to do with something essential about people's skin color. That's how we perceive it, right? We're drawing the line. We're categorizing people as white or non-white based on our preconceptions, based on our beliefs, right? And we could put the line in various places, right? So the first argument is there's too much physical variation, too much differences between people to simply categorize them into 8 groups, 10 groups. There's not 8 groups, there's not 10 groups, there's not 20 groups, there's not 30 groups, there's not 100 groups, there's not 1,000 groups. Humans are all just different from one another, right? No way to put people into a simple category of, say, white, Hispanic, black, or something like that. Okay, let's now focus on one specific racial group, right? Asian. And so the racial category of Asian says, okay, if you're Asian, then you are put into this racial category, and that means that you're all the same, right? That you're so similar to all the other Asian people in the world that you're different from all the other races, right? And you're Asian, and so there you have this clear characteristic that makes you part of this group, some physical characteristic or something. And the argument is, so that's Asian is one of the primary racial categories in the world. And the argument is that's ridiculous, right? That, think about what encompasses Asia. So Asia includes like 1/3 of the population of the entire world. It includes everybody from Japan to the Philippines to Vietnam to Thailand to India, right? Even to people in Pakistan, right? China, right? The category of Asian includes a huge swath of the world, right? A huge group of people. And to simply say that all those people are the same is an absurd conclusion, right? And so what we have is we have a bunch of people from, different places in the world, right? Different places in Asia, right? So here we have, for example, um, somebody from China, right? So it's, oh, well, he in our mind is somebody who is stereotypically Asian, right? Somebody from Japan, like, oh, don't they look so similar or something? This is the idea is going on. In Korean, right? But then what we begin to see is all these people are from Asia, but then they really don't look that similar, right? This is somebody from Thailand, right? This is a man from Laos, right? This is a man from Malaysia. This is a woman from Indonesia. This is a man from Burma. This is a man from Bangladesh, right? And we say, oh, well, do these people all really look the same? Do they all really have the same physical features? If we just, again, go back to this American idea of skin color, we can see that people who are in the Asian category of race really have different amounts of melanin in their skin, right? They have different skin tones, right? Even The Rock, right? So we are now going to be saying that The Rock is Asian, because he grew up in a Pacific island of Samoa, which is typically included in the racial category of Asian. So we see all these photos of these people, and what the category of race is doing is saying there's no differences between these people. They're all the same. They're all Asian. And, thinking about it, I believe that that's an absurd argument. That is an absurd belief to say that we're going to erase all the differences between these humans and say that they're all just all the same. All right, so that's the first two arguments. Third argument is that countries have different racial categories. If race was real, if race was something that was just a product of nature, something about the world that just was, then what we would imagine is that humans would have the same racial categories, that we would perceive race in the same way because race is real. But we don't. So for example, here are contemporary racial terms in America, right? And these are pretty typical, right? So we have 5, 6 of them. We could probably maybe add a few more in recent 21st century terms, right? But we have Caucasian, African American, Asian, Native American, Hispanic. But you go to another country, such as Brazil, and you find that their racial categories are much more complex. Brazil has a very complicated history in terms of race and slavery and colonization that has made Brazil have perceived race very carefully, right? What racial category you are in Brazil matters to a high degree, right? And so they have come up with all these terms for how to classify people. And you can see that it's a mixture of the different main racial groups. Right? And so you have to put somebody not just in terms of half white, half black. That's not a category. You're in a specific racial group if that's who you are, right? And so these are the official categories, racial categories that exist in Brazil. But the unofficial categories, the categories that people use in their everyday life, are even more complicated, more complex, right? More of them. And so Brazil has a much more careful and complicated perception of race than America does, right? Because it has a different history. And so the argument is, well, how could these two countries have such different racial categories? Because race is not real, right? They are perceiving it in different ways because race is an artificial construction. And because Brazil is a different society than America, Brazil has constructed race in a different way than America has constructed race. Okay, so we got so far, there's too much physical variation within people. The racial category of Asian shows how artificial the idea of race is. We see that different societies have different categories of race. Fourth, we can see that the categories of race change over time. right? Race is not a stable categorization. Race is something that fluctuates. As society changes, so does society's perceptions of race. Why? Because race is artificial. Race is not something real. Race is a social construction. So let's look at America. So what we see here is the categorization of race in the US Census. And so what we see here is on one of the first censuses, 1890, we have data for. What we see here is, a categorization of race that's really obsessed with what is it really focused on, right? How African American are you? What percentage, what degree of Black are you? Right? We can remember this is after the Civil War. This is still, Jim Crow era of America. And so really there's an obsession. We see an obsession with figuring out, how Black is somebody in America. And that we're seeing this in this census, right? And so that we can see that as that's the focus of America at this time, then that's being expressed in how America categorizes its racial groups. 10 years later, they decide to simplify it all. Like, oh no, that's too complicated. Let's just all make it really simple. And so now they have the racial categories of white, Black, Chinese, Japanese, and Indian. So now it's not, now the interest is how Asian are you and what type of Asian are you, right? So now the categorization is trying to understand the different categories of Asian. Again, this is a period of time in which there is an influx of Asian immigration. And so that is on people's minds. And so that is affecting how Americans perceive race. 30 years later, we make it more complex again. Right? It gets more complex, right? 20 years later, we make it a little bit more simple, right? 40 years later, more complex again. The point here is we can't keep a stable idea of what we mean by race in America. We keep changing it. We keep going from this thing to the next, right? Why? Because there is no stable thing that we're identifying, right? As race is an invention, an artificial creation, then there is no reality there in which we're actually labeling it. And so we're just changing it as our perceptions change. I think one of the best examples of how race is not real and how it has changed over time is the one-drop rule, right? So the one-drop rule was a rule adopted in the 19th century in many American states, such as Louisiana, Texas, Arkansas, North Carolina, Virginia, Mississippi, Maryland, and Indiana, right? And so basically what this rule said is if you have any African heritage, then you would be classified as Black, right? And so we can ask ourselves, what is that? Is that a categorization based on biology? No. What is the purpose of this then? Why have such a categorization? So this is an era of slavery. And so what this categorization is basically saying is deciding whether a person is a person or property. Right? Trying to decide whether this person is a citizen with full rights or whether this person is a commodity, an object that can be bought or sold. Right? And so what this clearly shows, this one-drop rule, is it shows that race is not a biological category, it is a legal category, right? And legal categorization is a product of humans, right? Not a product of physiology or nature. Lastly, but not least, in the last 15 to 20 years, it has been agreed by biologists that there is no biological basis to race. Right? When biologists have tried to find some way to actually categorize humans into different racial groups, they have failed, over and over and over and over again. Right? And so, there is no biological reality to race. Why? Because biologists tell us this. Right? One of the clearest examples is let's take DNA. Right? The argument here is, maybe if race is real, then the DNA of people of the same racial group should be more similar than other racial groups. But that's not true. There's as much difference, there's as much genetic variation between two people of the same racial category as people between or from different racial categories. So there's no way to categorize humans into races based on their DNA or genetics. And so for all these reasons, even though we think we can see race with our eyes, race is artificial. Race is something that is a construction of humans rather than a reality of nature. Okay, so at this point then, in the class, we move on to the topic of ethnicity. So we dealt with race, now we dealt with ethnicity, and now we want to try to figure out, well, what is this thing, ethnicity? How is ethnicity different from race? We often, in everyday language, we confuse these two terms, or we use them interchangeably. And so we now want to figure out, well, what is ethnicity different from race? So we had this activity, talk about people's ethnic backgrounds, people can share, but I'm going to skip ahead, obviously. Okay, so we got ethnicity now. We want to figure out how ethnicity is different from race. First thing, so ethnicity is, generally speaking, a categorization that's not based on physical differences, but based on cultural differences, right? So you're a certain ethnicity because of the language you speak, the type of food you eat, your clothing style, right? All those cultural aspects of humans, right? And so your ethnicity, because you have a distinct culture, right? So we can think of Irish culture, right? So the idea of language, Gaelic, Irish cuisine, Irish dancing, Irish dress, right? That this all this makes somebody Irish, right? Have this background of having an ethnic background of being Irish, right? So kind of cultural differences. That's the first thing. Second, it's this idea of a common heritage. Right here, the idea is that ethnicity is who you are descended from, right? And that there's this kind of long primordial history that you can trace back your heritage or your ethnic heritage to a certain place in the world, and that you feel a kinship because if somebody else can trace back their heritage to the same place in the world, then you're of the same ethnicity, right? And so a person connects back their identity to a certain nation or geography of the world. So again, what makes somebody Irish? Because they have an ethnic ancestry based in Ireland, right? That Ireland is a place in the world, and so somebody can think of themselves as Irish because they have this roots. Their grandparents or great grandparents or somebody came from Limerick or Dublin or something like that. They trace their heritage back, and so that makes them feel a kinship or feel a sense of being the same or similar as other people who can do the same thing in America. Then categorization based on the way somebody looks, right? That we think of people of a certain ethnicity as having the same physical characteristics, right? Similar hair, similar skin, similar features, right? So again, this picture of somebody from Ireland, we think of them as stereotypically Irish, because of the way they look, their hair color, skin color, right? And they have Irish features. This is what we think. Again, we think we can perceive somebody being French or perceive somebody being German or Russian or something like that. But this makes us pause. We're like, oh, wait a second. Wasn't the difference that ethnicity was based on culture and race was based on physical difference? And so then we can ask ourselves, well, what really is the difference then between race and ethnicity? Like I thought the difference was physical features versus culture, but now you're telling me that ethnicity is also based on physical features. What's going on? How can this be happening? How can it be happening? Because both race and ethnicity are not real, right? That they are artificial creations of humans. And so because there's not a reality behind them, then it all gets confusing. It all gets messed up. And becomes no clear way to pull them apart because we just think of them as the same. If there is a difference, what is the difference? Ethnicity tends to be more flexible, right? It tends to be within people's control. That, although we're going to see that this is complicated, right? So your ethnicity can change. And we can see this with immigration, right? Somebody from a young age moves from one part of the world to the next. They go from Poland to America. They come here when they're like 6 weeks old. They grew up and they don't think of themselves as Polish. Their parents might be Polish. They just think of themselves as American, right? Or whatever. And so the idea is you can switch your ethnicity. Over time, over generations, a family's ethnicity can actually be transformed. Whereas race, we think of as something as more permanent, right? We think, oh, well, if this is somebody's race, that's what their race is, because it's about something essential, something just an innate part of their being, right? As we're going to see, both race and ethnicity are artificial identities, right? So they're we're going to see that this this idea that ethnicity is flexible and race is permanent is not a reality, but rather just what we think, what we perceive, because both of these things are artificial. Okay, so like we did with race, let's talk about how ethnicity is a social construction. So we can talk about the social construction of ethnicity through this concept of what's called symbolic ethnicity. So symbolic ethnicity is basically this idea that a person can choose which ethnic group to identify with, right? And that ethnic group, that choice comes with a low social cost, right? That choosing your symbolic ethnicity is something positive, right? It comes with very little negative consequences. And so this symbolic ethnicity is really based around cultural practices, right? It's based on things like the language you speak, the food you eat, even like the type of religion you practice, right? And so it's really based on a person's cultural background. And the idea here is that cultural background is within a person's control. You can learn a language. You can eat a certain type of food. You can learn a certain dance. And so the important thing here then is of the idea of ethnic options, that ethnic options tend to be, that your ethnicity, symbolic ethnicity, tends to be flexible, tends to be within your control, right? Tends to be optional, that a person can kind of have some power or ability to decide which ethnicity to identify with. However, the argument is that this ethnic option, is more available to white Americans, right? And if we weren't in class, we would have a discussion about whether or not this is changing. But let's go with the argument right now, and you can ask yourself this question: are things changing? The traditional argument is that this ethnic options, this ability to control which ethnicity you identify with, is something that is historically more claimed by white Americans than non-white Americans. Okay, so let's now see the ways that it can be optional. So the first option that people can have is the option of whether or not to have an ethnic background. Okay? And so the argument is that white Americans can more often claim to not have an ethnicity. They can simply be American, right? That if you ask a white American to say, oh, what's your ethnic background? They will often say, well, I'm American. that's my ethnic background. They don't have to be hyphenated, right? They don't have to identify themselves as Polish or Scottish or English or something like that. They can just be plain old American, right? They have the option to be just to have no ethnic background, or they can choose an ethnic background. They can emphasize their ethnicity, right? They can choose to say, oh, well, no, I'm a Polish American. I think of myself as Polish, and I eat Polish food. I go to a Polish Orthodox church, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I think of myself as being a Polish American, right? The thing, though, is the argument is that's within that person's control, right? That's within that person's power. They can choose whether or not to identify as being Polish American or whether just to be plain old American. And the argument is, well, why would somebody do that? Why would somebody want to identify as being Polish American or Italian American or French American, whatever? It makes a person feel more unique, right? It's something positive. It makes them feel special, right? It makes them feel like that they have a unique heritage, right? So, for example, for me personally, if people were to ask me and I would think about it, I would say, oh, I'm Scottish American because my grandmother is from Scotland, right? And so I could emphasize that. I could say, oh, I'm Scottish American, and that would make me feel, to a certain degree special, right? This idea of symbolic ethnicity, that it's something positive. It's positive because it makes somebody feel unique. The argument is then, can people who are non-white, can they choose that? Can they choose not to be ethnic? An argument, traditionally speaking, is no, and we see this in the very names of people, right? So let's take somebody who's Asian American, right? Can a person who's Asian American decide not to be identified as Asian American? No, right? The argument is that other people, other Americans will identify them that way, whether or not they choose to identify themselves that way, right? And so that being Asian American is not within your own choice, but it's something that is put on you, right? So at this point, let me see if I can play the video. It kind of breaks up the lecture a little bit, and it's a short video. I play it because it's a good example of this argument, but it's also funny. It's comedian. It's comedic. All right, let's see if I can go. You should hopefully all be seeing this in your screen. So I'm going to play the video and then I'll keep silent.
Hi there.
Hi.
Nice day, huh?
Yeah, finally, right?
Where are you from? Your English is perfect.
San Diego. We speak English there.
Oh, no. Where are you from?
Well, I was born in Orange County, but I never actually lived there.
I mean before that.
Before I was born.
Yeah, where are your people from?
Well, my great-grandma was from Seoul.
Korean. I knew it. I was like, she's either Japanese or Korean, but I was leaning more towards Korean.
Amazing.
Shasina. There's a really good teriyaki barbecue place near my apartment. So I actually really like kimchi.
Cool. What about you? Where are you from?
San Francisco.
But where are you from?
No, I'm just American.
Really? You're Native American?
No, just regular American. Oh, well, I guess my grandparents are from England.
Oh, well.
What's all this then? Dropping the bone into you? Let's get a sporty! Double, toil and trouble! Mind the gap, beware Jack the Ripper! Bloody hell! Pip, cheerio!
I think your people's fish and chips are amazing.
You're weird.
Really? I'm weird? Must be a Korean thing.
So we see in that video a really good example of this idea, right? This idea that if you're non-white, if you're identified as Asian, that's not really your choice. That other people, other Americans will identify you and perceive your Asianness and perceive you to be, having a certain, background that they can ask about. And that's not within your control. That's not an option for you. Right? And so your ethnicity is something that is mandatory. Whereas the white American, he can just say, "Oh, I'm a regular American," right? He can decide that he has no ethnicity. That he can think of himself as English, but he can just not really have that. Okay, so that's the first option. The first option is whether or not to be and have an ethnicity, or just whether to be plain old American. The second option is that people can choose from multiple backgrounds, right? So many people, particularly many people, but many Americans have multiple ethnic backgrounds. They are English and Polish, or from Germany or from Spain, or they have multiple backgrounds in their heritage. And so the ethnic option is which one to emphasize, right? To say, oh, well, I have this ethnicity is more important to me. I feel more Irish than I do Polish. And so I'm really going to think of myself as an Irish American, rather than a Polish American, right? And so, you can get to choose, which ethnicity to emphasize, which one you want to put in the front, right? Again, the argument is that tends to be true for white Americans, but for non-white Americans, that is not so much an option. Rather, it's their race that categorizes them, right? That if a person is perceived to be, say, Hispanic, right, because of their physical features, then a person will be identified as being Hispanic rather than, say, German or Irish or one of their other ethnic backgrounds, because that's what people are perceiving, that they're in some sense their racial categories trumping their ethnic category. Third, an option is whether to turn it off or on, right? That there are certain times where a person can choose or decide whether to emphasize their ethnicity, and then for the rest of the time to leave it, let it be, or leave it, turn it off, right? And I think a classic example of this is St. Patrick's Day, right? In St. Patrick's Day, anybody who thinks of themselves as slightly Irish American will suddenly become Irish American for that day or for that week, right? That they're on that holiday, their Irish background gets emphasized, gets pushed to the front, right? But for the rest of the year, they might not think about it. Then that might not be part of their identity, right? And so a person can do this. They can turn off and on. They go to an Italian restaurant and they tell their friends, "Oh, by the way, I'm part Italian," right? And they can decide, that this is a thing. Again, it's in their control, and because it's in their control, they can turn on and off. Again, the argument is that this is not true for non-whites, right? So, for example, if you're African American, it's being African American is not something you can not be this week, right? You can't decide that today, Wednesday, you're not going to be African American. No, that is an identity that, again, the argument goes, is something that you have to have all the time, and so therefore it's not within your control, right? And so again, argument is the question becomes, whether this is changing, whether in the 21st century, everybody has more options now, not just white Americans. And so, that's something to think about. So we've talked about race and the social construction of race. We talked about ethnicity and symbolic ethnicity. Here's the last thing I would want to end with in terms of particularly ethnicity. We have to understand that race and ethnicity is experienced in different ways for different Americans, right? The experience of race and ethnicity for white Americans is not the same for non-white Americans. It's not the same identity. It's not the same experience. For white Americans, it can be something positive. It can be something that makes you unique. It can make you feel distinct. And so white Americans can sometimes often like to talk about it. You know, they're like, oh, where are you from? What's your background? And they think of this as, you know, an interesting conversation, a conversation starter. We could talk about our different backgrounds, and it's a way to share and to get to know people, because ethnicity is experienced typically as something positive. But for non-white Americans, ethnicity and race can often be, or sometimes be, something that is negative. It's not always a positive thing. It's not something that's as optional or flexible, and it can come with negative stereotypes. It can produce negative consequences in a person's life. And so rather than it being a positive thing that makes somebody feel unique and different, ethnicity can be a negative, and race can be a negative. And so I guess the main thing to understand for all people, no matter your race or ethnicity, is to understand that the experience of race and ethnicity is affecting people in different ways. And so to understand, to try to understand where other people are coming from. Okay, I hope that was an interesting lecture. If you have any questions, please let me know.